Hello and welcome to Bright Wings, children's books to make the heart soar. I am your host, Charity Hill. The purpose of this conversation is to help mothers and fathers identify books that will liberate their children to embrace truth, goodness, and beauty. The title of this podcast is How to Go to the Library, a practical and theoretical guide. I've had a number of listeners ask me if I would please do a podcast episode on this. So I figured they couldn't be alone. I am especially indebted to Ava Camera and Marianne von Bracht and their families for the good questions these ladies have raised about how to go to the library. Folks, we're going to be talking about some hard-hitting questions such as why use the library? Can you still have fun at the library even if you have toddlers? How do you avoid bringing home books that are inappropriate or subpar? What the dickens is the difference between Hoopla and Libby, and how can these resources serve my family? What criteria do you use when selecting books for your kids, books which you've never read before? Not just picture books, but chapter books also. And I'm even going to address an upper level question about how to get books that aren't in the catalog. Before we dive into these interesting questions, I was wondering if I could beg a favor of you. I was wondering if you could please, if you're listening on iTunes, would you please rate this podcast? Just give it a few stars. How about all 4? And write a review as if you were going to recommend the podcast to your friend. For some reason, algorithms like it. But even better, maybe just send an episode that you like to a friend, a sibling, a cousin, a neighbor. I would be so grateful. When I was little, growing up in small town Herscher, Illinois, we did not have a public library. I was probably almost 8 or 9, maybe even 10 years old when the school library started to be open periodically during the summer. It was amazing. I felt like Belle in Beauty and the Beast. And it was an old gym that had been converted to a media center / library. There was an upper level that had been built around the top of the gym, which held books for the older students. Amazing. I remember just walking in there and the air was cool and air conditioned, and I loved how it smelled of books and new carpeting. It didn't have any windows. Then again, neither did our high school library, which was, I'm afraid, largely ignored. I never was in it except for the odd bit of study hall in high school. Poor, sad, dark library, underused and ignored with books no one was reading. Except maybe like V.C. Andrews. Yikes. Hopefully, nobody was reading too many of those. The libraries that I experienced in college and grad school were increasingly beautiful, but I didn't really go into a public library for children and into a children's section of a public library until I'd had my first child. I took my 18-month-old into this small, quiet public library in a quiet neighborhood where everyone was away at work or in daycare. I was one of the only stay-at-home moms I felt like on the planet. And I discovered something magical, something that I had not experienced, which was a children's library. Of course, all that my 18-month-old wanted to do was pull books off the shelf until she realized she could open them. What a wonder to discover that it didn't matter which order the board books went back on the shelf. They didn't have to be in alpha numerical order. It was wonderful to discover a nook in this very busy, very adult city that was actually just for children, that was centered around what a child is. And I'll never forget, I called my daughter Silly Sally because she was being goofy, and the librarian said, "Oh, you know that book?" And I said, "What book?" And she said, "Oh, Silly Sally. Let me show you." And it became a favorite. We opened Silly Sally in that light-filled library and laughed. Now, as time has marched on, and as I have added more children to our family, my trips to the library have not always been this incredibly idyllic. But I confess I am a bibliophile. I love being surrounded by books. I love the look of books. I love how books look stacked. I love how books look shelved. I like just being around books. And I think that's really healthy. It's almost as comforting as a well-stocked pantry. Maybe more comforting. Definitely more exciting. When I come home from the library with a haul of books that weighs probably the same as my body weight, I feel like a queen. I feel like I'm just hauling in loot. I'm filling the granaries with the harvest or something. So allow me to persuade you, if you aren't yet convinced, that going to the library is worth it. My children are always amazed, or maybe a couple years ago, they just continued to be astounded by the fact that we didn't have to pay for the books. They are all free. Going to the library saves you tons of money, not buying every book about which you're curious. Buy a book if it's magical. Buy a book if you've borrowed it twice from the library and you love it. Although, let it be said, sometimes you have to buy a book you love so that your child can live with it long enough to love it. But on the whole, my philosophy is that you borrow a book to date it before you make it a part of your family. And because of this book courting process, I don't think I've ever had buyer's remorse when it comes to purchasing books. Financially, going to the library is budget friendly, and it seems wrong not to make use of your tax money for all it's worth. You've paid for it. This is your community place. It belongs to you and to your children. Now, that being said, Catherine Leano, my sister, the one from episode 13, Gardening is Humanizing, she doesn't go to the library, but rarely, but she possesses one of the most mesmerizing collections of children's books in her house. When I go to her house to visit her, I browse her bookshelves and get good ideas. So it's possible to not go to the library and to just make use of the reservation and pickup opportunities that a library membership offers. Plenty of moms and dads just skip what can be a stressful situation to navigate. If you just go once in person and obtain a library card, then you can log onto the library site and request books for pickup. And this can be just lovely. I remember thinking that everything should be like this. Now it is a lot more like this. Actually, we can do this with our groceries now as never before, for example. But 5 years ago, when I discovered that you could pull up to the library window and collect the books off your list, it was all very new and very delightful, like as pleasing as it was when I was little to pull up to the outside bank teller window and get a lollipop. But then there's just that time of life when it seems like nothing is easy. Navigating that library website can be tricky. Perhaps many libraries have more accessible websites now, but I remember being on a computer or on a phone for an extended period of time, trying to request materials and select the pickup option for each one. It was nuts. If I was checking my email, I could do it without interruption, but if it was important, if it required memory recall, attention, or thoughtfulness, it's like my children could sense that my attention was intently focused somewhere else, and they would go kook. Something would happen. Or I'd get everything picked up and selected, but it wouldn't have, something would go wrong with the website, or something wouldn't load properly, or I couldn't entirely see all of the screen because it wasn't optimized for mobile, something. I know I have a podcast, but I am not very techie. And by and large, I really prefer to do everything in person. But then again, going to the library wasn't exactly a picnic anymore either. There was a time in my life where I had an 8-year-old, a 5-year-old, and twin 2-year-olds who were like tornadoes of destruction. When it comes to reading, I have kind of, laser-like focus. And so if I open a book at the library, the world kind of disappears around me. And so I look up from a book and they could have pretty much unshelved all of the stacks in the entire library. But at this point in my life, there was the most incredible library. The first time I walked in, I practically wanted to cry because I felt like, wow, you know what we need. You know what we need. They had a table full of Mega Blocks, huge buckets of Mega Blocks. They had a train table, a play kitchen. They had puzzles. They had boards with letters that were magnetic and you could trace them. They had educational puzzles. My biggest fear was not losing my children or that they were going to unshelve most of the library's books, but actually it became whether they were going to catch hand, foot, and mouth disease, which they did. But that's a story for another time. My point is this library knew what we needed. We need to be encouraging our libraries. We need to encourage anyone who's part of building libraries. We need to encourage our librarians to have these areas that make it possible for families to go to the library together. I don't love the modern industrial architecture of many of our newest libraries, but one thing that they're doing wonderfully is the space that they're setting aside for children. I love that they're full of natural light, even if they're not full of beautifully carved wood. I love that they have couches, they have engaging toys and rugs to play on and sit on, and even gardens. This library I was telling you about with all the good educational toys also had an outdoor garden. I would take my twins there when they were in preschool. I'd pick them up from preschool with lunches, and we would go to the library garden and just sit there and eat outside. And they had a small, thank God, water feature that they enjoyed playing with. It was something lovely to do, and it was totally free. It was an event, and yet it was just easy to wrap into our schedule. Now in this hazy time where we're post-COVID, or maybe we're not post-COVID, our libraries are maybe not fully open. Our toys aren't totally available. Things are different. What do we do now? How do we bring our children to the library in this new situation? Or let's say you've got a library that doesn't have these play options, these toy options to keep the very little children busy while you are helping your other children to find books. How do you go to the library with children who are toddlers or otherwise have very limited impulse control? I'm going to call this scenario number 1, and I'll talk about it, and then I'm going to talk about scenario number 2, which is going to the library with children who are reasonably self-controlled. So for scenario number 1, I'm just going to use myself as an example to give you an idea. It's the example of when I had an 8-year-old, a 5-year-old, and twin 2-year-olds. And for the sake of this example, I'm going to imagine what I would do if I didn't have access to those mega blocks and that train table. First of all, I would try to go in with a plan and low expectations. It's not going to be as fun as it used to be to go to the library under these conditions. Not as fun because it has to be so focused. It's not going to have the kind of relaxed exploratory quality perhaps that I would like because I have to keep my toddlers from unshelving out the books. That is exercise number 1. And the simultaneous plan is to find high quality reading material for my children. So in order to accomplish it's best if I go in with a list in my pocket already of titles that I want to acquire that day. Even better is if I've put the books that I really want to borrow already on reserve for myself. Then I walk over, I pluck my books off the reserve shelf, and I pop them into my canvas bag. And I take a deep breath because I've already accomplished a lot. But let me say, in my current scenario, the real first thing that I would do is I would strap one of my twins on my back. Perhaps I would put the more rambunctious twin on my back before ever setting foot in the library. And if the other twin would tolerate it, I would put them in a stroller and give them a very tidy snack before ever walking into the library to claim my books that are already on reserve. And maybe that would work for a lot of you if your children can sit in a stroller. If you know you have a limited window with the child in the stroller, the other idea I have is I would bribe my older child into sitting with the other twin and reading to that child. I would arrange ahead of time with her that I would be paying her a little babysitter money or a treat. Something that would persuade my book-loving, library-loving oldest child to do this for her sibling and for me. All right, and so what am I doing with one baby on my back and the other one being read to by the big sister? Well, I'm deploying my resources optimally. I am connecting with my middle child. I'm helping that daughter find books, or I am looking for good books for my twins, or I am hunting down a possible title for my older girl who's reading to her siblings. Now, thinking through this as a scenario versus what I actually did, one thing I would do differently now, knowing what I know, is that I would put those books on reserve. I would set aside, or I would claim the books that I really want based off friends' recommendations or podcasts. And then I would let my children pick books, and I would sort it out at home, letting them pick some of their own books And then weeding out the ones that aren't quality at home would have taken pressure off trips to the library when my twins were so little. So one of the things I want to address is that I think it's very important to have expectations and parameters already in place when you go to the library with your children. Parameters that I talked about way back in episode 1, actually. Parameters like our family only checks out books that are books that aren't based on TV shows or movies and do not have illustrations derived from TV shows or movies. When your children are very little, that's a very easy parameter to put in place, and you can shake your head at this or that book that they bring up to you to check out. I think that's easy for a 3 or 4-year-old to be able to grasp. After all, it's those popular TV movie illustrations that caught that child's attention, probably. Again, the Cheeto analogy. You eat a few Cheetos, it's not going to cause some overall harm. If you bring a couple of junk food books home, it's not going to destroy your child's imagination. But I think it's easy to start making exceptions. And so I think it's good from the beginning to try to move in the direction you plan to continue. If you have some parameters, it's easy to start having conversations about them and the meaning behind your decisions. My children know that I have veto power in the end. So they know the basic parameters, and truly they love good books too. And so they know I have this veto power. So if I would just allow them to bring kind of whatever looks kind of decent home, and then I weed through and filter some of it at home, I think that would have given us a lot. It would have given me less stress at the library when we were under the time constraints and the physical constraints that having very young children sometimes imposes. And while we're busy talking about going to the library with very little children, it's perhaps helpful if I read to you some thoughts from a friend of mine who said, regarding taking little children to the library for story time, she said if it weren't for interactive story time, a particular friend wouldn't have gone to the library with her children. And now she does. It's a regular thing they do. And those children are bibliophiles. But for friend B, for her kids, she felt like she was sending a mixed message to her little children, telling them they could be allowed around everyone in the library. And in this case, the story times are held in a wide open space in the library in the general area, not in a separate location. And she felt like she was sending a mixed message to her children when they could be loud around everyone in the library when everyone else was loud, but not after story time. So story time was a tricky thing to navigate for friend A and B. How do you help your children love being at the library, feel welcome and at home in the library? How can you help them be excited about books and excited to be at the library and yet acting with courtesy towards other patrons? I can tell you something that took me really far in life. Well, life at the library. When I was at this difficult stage with my children, this challenging stage with my children, I just walked up to the librarian with the biggest, most heart-melting smile on my face that I could manage and showed them my list and said, hello. And they could see I was draped with kids. Hello, these are the books that I would like, and I have a limited amount of time to be able to find them. Would you be able to help me? Usually you can bond with a librarian over your mutual love for books. If you use phrases like thank you and please and I'm so grateful and thank you for making this happen, or you have just made my life so much easier, this is such a great library. You will give them the joy of their job. Frankly, in the children's section of the library that I'm thinking about, the one that we went to when my twins were so small, in this section of the children's library for probably 6 months to a year, whenever I would walk into the library with my 4 children, one of the librarians would basically make time for me if I was walking over to the desk. Another thing that you can do is you can be with your very little children at the library and you can assign your child to a librarian. They can have their book list and some rules for engagement questions. You can practice at home having them ask the librarian for help, or you could ask the librarian to help your child. Then you could look after your own toddlers to keep them from unshelving the books. It's not as much fun for the mama, but it would still be a very worthwhile trip to the library. Again, one of the things that makes trips to the library easier is that the more often you go, the more opportunities you have to shape your child's interaction with that environment. All right, so scenario number 2, going to the library with children who are reasonably self-controlled, but still have their own agendas, their own lists of what they are looking for and what they're hoping to find. How do you balance those needs? Well, it's like a modified version of scenario number 1. I could assign an older child to help a younger child find what the younger child is interested in before they go off on their own to go book hunting. I trust my 13-year-old's taste and internal compass. She could help her 7-year-old sister or brother. At this stage, I feel like I can pay more attention to what they're trying to check out, and I don't have to do so much vetoing, and I don't have to weed out so much at home. I kind of do some of that at the library. Here in scenario number 2, what I'm trying to figure out is who is needing what. I know one thing I need to be doing is I need to be giving greater attention to my son's interests and my 10-year-old girl's interests. So I need to help my 10-year-old locate books because she loves listening to books, helping her find such books, some audiobooks. So a library time priority for me is helping my daughter find books that she can either listen to or books that will motivate her to read. The biggest question in going to the library in scenario number 2 is, whose turn is it for a little extra care? A good thing for me to do would be for me to go to the library separately from my children because of this podcast and because I am like just another kid in the candy store at the library. I get very immersed in the books to which I'm attracted and the books I'm trying to find out more about. So it's hard for me to pay attention to meeting my children's book needs. Well, I'm trying to meet my own and theirs, and it gets complicated. So a good thing for me to do would be for me to do podcast-related book searching separately from my children, probably literally at a separate visit to the library. So some of the parameters that we operate with are, does the book look true, good, or beautiful? A friend's mom used to tell her children, if it looks old, you can check it out, which can be a handy shorthand, perhaps. I can tell you personally that we avoid the youth adult section of novels unless we're looking for a specific book and we're going into that room to claim a specific book. I don't let my 10 and 13-year-olds browse in the young adult fiction room. And frankly, they're really not interested. For the most part, my older daughters are interested in books recommended by friends, or they're looking for a new book written by an author they've read previously. One thing to note when going to the library with children of mixed ages, I don't worry about keeping my children at my hip or attached to my hand. If I lose sight of them, but I can hear them, I don't worry. If I know they're in earshot or eyeshot, I let that be. I know where the exits are, and I'm very aware of the surroundings, but I've let go of the anxiety of having to have my eyes on them at all times. Of course, I'm not proposing that you act with negligence. I'm just advocating some prudential 1980s parenting, right? We need things that are going to make it more doable to go to the library and enjoy the experience. So I'm proposing this so that you can be less anxious, but I can't, of course, guarantee what other patrons or librarians will think of this approach at the library. I only know it's worked for me. One thing that I think it's really important to own, I have to confess that going to the library is not what it used to be. So I promised you that I would talk about whether going to the library can still be fun. And I think going to the library is just not what it used to be. It used to be a sweetly contemplative, exploratory experience. But again, it's not a thoroughly utilitarian experience nowadays either. But there's definitely it's definitely an experience that has changed over time. Here we are back at our food analogy from episode 1. But I feel like going to the library now is a little bit like going to the grocery store. Early in my marriage, my husband and I would go to the grocery store. We would actually go to Whole Foods, and we would sort of just like dreamily walk along, holding hands and getting inspiration for cooking from the ingredients at the grocery store. It was like being on a date. It was really nice. And when I had two children, one and then two children, it was going to the library was a lovely experience. But it has gotten much more intentional and practical as time has gone on. We are not going all the time. And when we go, we really want to make it count. So it's not a thoroughly utilitarian experience, but neither is it this sweet exploratory experience either. And to continue the analogy, I say no to the candy aisle at the grocery store, just like I say no to books with illustrations from TVs or movies. I try to avoid impulse purchases, and I try to avoid impulse rentals at the library. Just like at the store, if I'm buying a new product, I'm probably going to buy it from a brand or a food maker that I trust. At the library, I'm going to probably stick with an author or an illustrator that I know to be quality, that I already respect and I'm already familiar with. But just like at the store, sometimes you bring home that box of lettuce that looked so good at first at the store. You bring it home and you open it up and you're like, wow, this is rotten inside. Sometimes you bring home a book from the library that's a little rotten inside and you have to just tell your kids, oh, can't read this one. And that's okay. We just get used to that being our framework. Mama has veto power. And of course, you can explain why this book is not a good choice for your family or why it is in conflict with the principles we've talked about truth, goodness, or beauty. You can still learn something from a book that isn't worth reading. Now, if only libraries had the kind of lighting that Whole Foods does. Let's turn our attention to another question. How do you get books that you want which aren't in the catalog? This is a lovely thing called interlibrary loan, and you can ask your librarian about it. I would like this book. How can I get a hold of a copy? Is it possible that I could have it through interlibrary loan? That's one option. Another option is to request that the library purchase it. Some libraries have this form even on their website. So if they get one very good recommendation or it's requested by several patrons, the library is likely to buy the book. Also along these lines, it's worth knowing that there are other libraries to which you can have access. Sometimes community colleges or universities near you have children's book collections because they have an education degree program, right? For like a teacher's college. Most colleges' libraries are open to the public. Very exciting. Think of all those lonely books that need to be cheered up by your kids. And a couple of other things to flag for your interest. Ask your librarian or look at your website and figure it out yourself how you can go about recording the books that you've checked out from the library so that you can still access those lists of books that you've checked out. So let's say 2 years ago, you read to your older child this really wonderful book and you can't think of the title or the author. You could either drive your librarian crazy while she searches for the random things you remember, or that's what I would do, poor librarian. Or you can access this list, go back 2 years, and look for yourself for what the title of this book is. So the kind of librarian that could help you do that is called a reader's advisory librarian or a reader's advisory department at the library. All right, one other nugget that a friend provided for me. This is a very interesting piece of information. Get this. Nonfiction books for the pre-K and kindergarten crowd can be found in the juvenile nonfiction sections. Even though typically these sections are usually separate, right? They keep picture books, early readers on different shelves. The pre-K and kindergarten nonfiction work is found alongside the juvenile nonfiction sections. That's really important if you're looking for a kid who's interested in nonfiction. I have one of those. All right, as a final question, let's dig into the difference between Libby and Hoopla as resources that are available to you through your library. First, Libby. Libby is now made by Overdrive. I think they've combined and they have overlap. Libby is a library streaming platform that gives you ebooks and audiobooks. So it's a listening and reading app. Hoopla is a library media streaming platform. So it's ebooks and audiobooks plus TV shows and movies. Okay, some of the differences. Digital content for Libby is not always immediately available. And the reason is that the library has a certain number of digital copies that are available. With Hoopla, you might have immediate access, but you have a limited number of titles which you can borrow each month. So that prohibits binge watching, for example. The limit for Libby and for Hoopla depends on your library's local budget. Sometimes digital content providers and publishing houses will provide new and popular books with kind of bursts of access. So there'll be a lot more copies available initially when the book is first out. One difference between Libby and Hoopla in terms of their book content is that new titles are added to Libby, but not taken away. So the Libby library grows and grows. For Hoopla, its content is switched in and out. So your same library may have both apps. Are you sticking with me? Your same library may have both Libby and Hoopla. The weird thing is you may not get the same access to content. For example, your library may have a physical book on its shelf. It may have the book, an audio version in Libby or an e-version in Libby, but not have it in Hoopla. One advantage of Hoopla is that Hoopla has a kids mode, and a reviewer named Alyssa Rovblevsky, she wrote for Arts Management and Technology Laboratory in August of 2020. She wrote that she thinks Hoopla is better for comics and illustrated materials, such as probably picture books, I'm guessing, as well as movies and TV. But Alyssa's review says Libby is better for written reading material and the sheer variety of books that it has available. Again, Libby is ebooks, digital books, and audiobooks. So for me, I would prefer Libby because I'm only interested in what kinds of audiobooks these apps provide. I actually really hate reading off devices, and I don't want my children reading off my phone. And that's because, remember, we don't have any tablets. So I'm just providing you with this hard-hitting research because I love you and because I want you to know. Chances are you could have done this part of the podcast better than I could have. I basically just learned it for the sake of sharing it with you. Well, I hope you've enjoyed thinking about how to go to the library. I hope it has answered a few questions. Hopefully it's helped you articulate some of your needs or seen your situation in a new way. It's too bad we can't go together and kind of tag team it, eh? Have courage and happy hunting.